The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. The state of Missouri recently took away the pay of workers in St. Louis who had been getting a higher minimum wage. Labor economist Sylvia Allegretto says that in Seattle, the higher minimum wage has worked well without throwing people out of work. Political expert Dante Chinni says maybe it takes a general to keep Trump in line, and predicts it will take a whole lot before he is removed from office. And John Nichols of The Nation talks with Bill Press about his new book, Trumpocalypse. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Republicans, again, are not letting facts get in the way of good policy. In Missouri, the state government cut the wages people of St. Louis were making, but labor economist Sylvia Allegretto makes the strong case why a $15 an hour wage makes sense. And we say hello to Sylvia Allegretto, a labor economist and co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley, also the co-author of a recent report on the effect of a minimum wage increase in Seattle. Sylvia Allegretto, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
It's nice to be here.
And nice to have you with us as well. As a labor economist and an advocate of raising the minimum wage, can you tell us how it's worked in the cities where it has been tried, including Seattle?
Right. Well, so far so good. We're seeing wage increases for the lowest wage workers, which is good. That's the way the policy is meant to be working. But thus far, our interim report, for instance, in Seattle, has shown that we haven't seen any negative effects on employment in that city. And don't forget, we've had minimum wage increases, especially at the state level, for decades now. And so there's a huge body of literature showing that thus far, but of course, we haven't seen any negative employment effects to those increases at the state level for over these couple of decades. But those were fairly modest compared to what a lot of the phase-ins that are happening, that are actively being phased in cities such as Seattle that are going to 15. So we have to keep an eye on them. We'll be evaluating them in as real time as possible as they go forward.
Now, is the purpose to improve the overall economy or to improve the lot of the individual hamburger flipper? I mean, do those goals somehow work against each other?
Well, first of all, I think we do want to do both of those things. We want to improve the lot of the low-wage worker, which you identified as a hamburger flipper. But don't forget, I mean, there's a lot of occupations that are low-wage and minimum-wage workers: parking lot attendants and retail, cashiers, stockers, janitors, housekeepers, home health care workers. There's a lot of folks, and by the way, most of them not teenagers. The average age of a minimum wage worker is about 30, 32, I believe. And so, yes, we want to improve the circumstances, the economic circumstances of the low-wage workforce, their families, and those communities which they're often living in disproportionately in communities together. So, if you increase the minimum wage, you'll be helping them. But in the end, it does help the overall economy. There is some evidence now that the degree of inequality that we have, and that degree has much to do with a lot of low-wage workers who have fallen further and further behind over the last few decades, that actually is hampering economic growth. So one thing we need to do is a better distribution of the massive wealth that we have in this country. As you know probably, and you've probably talked about, inequality is vast and rampant, and there's no end in sight to it. So one thing we can do, we have a policy tool, the minimum wage, and that will help us with individual workers, their families, communities, and the overall economy to some extent.
Does the fact that cities and states are taking it upon themselves, as they have done in the past from time to time, but the fact that they're doing it now when it seems to be a lot more egregious, this gap, than it's ever been, does that put pressure on the federal government to finally do something about the mandated minimum wage?
Well, one of the reasons that you're seeing so much action at the state and the local levels on minimum wages is because of the fact that the federal minimum wage at $7.25 an hour has been so since 2009. So those things do kind of go hand in hand. And you do see some pressure at the federal level, but it's probably not going to happen anytime soon with the administration. But yeah, I think it does put some pressure, and it's important because the federal minimum wage remains very important because you have a lot of states that have these preemption laws, meaning their cities cannot go higher than the federal rate. These are cities that typically are, never, or states that are never higher than the federal rate, but you've seen some action lately. You've seen, for instance, Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky increase their minimum wage beyond the Kentucky state rate, and then the state went back and said, oh no, we're not going to let you do that. They have preemption, meaning that you cannot go above the state rate, and they actually took those raises away. So as they do this, and as preemption spreads across the country, and it is, that's another reason why the federal rate becomes so much more important. Otherwise, those states, many of them in the South, for instance, are never going to see increases in the minimum wage, not even at the local level, because they're making it illegal to do so.
We're speaking with Sylvia Allegretto, labor economist and co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. And she's also co-author of a recent report on the effect of a minimum wage increase in Seattle, which is what our discussion is pertaining to today. If a higher wage is in effect for the lowest paid workers in an industry, Sylvia, does that also increase the pay of workers higher on the pay scale within that industry?
Well, I mean, what you're referring to is what we call the ripple effect, right? Because, if somebody is making $7.25 an hour and you raise the minimum wage to $8.25 an hour, everybody within that dollar range will get some type of an increase. But somebody that's making, $8.30 an hour or $8.40 an hour, just above the new mandated, they will probably get increases too. Though it's called a ripple effect. It has been, empirically found in research for past minimum wages of about 15%. But will we see this type of ripple effect when you have, minimum wages that are higher than we have typically seen? We're not sure of that yet, and it may be that we'll see some wage compression, at least for a period of time. But as time passes, probably the wage scale will come back again. That's definitely a possibility. But in general, in the past, we do know that there has been that ripple effect, and it's yet to be seen how much that will stay in place with some of these higher minimum wages that are now being phased in.
Does it stand to reason that if an employer has to pay a higher minimum wage, there will possibly be fewer hours available, if not fewer jobs, for those at the bottom of the scale?
Well, my research has shown that over the past 30 years, again, the mostly state increases over the last 30, 35 years has not reduced employment or hours. But again, those were fairly modest increases. And we've had long periods of time, like we're in now, where the federal minimum wage didn't change for, 8-10 years. So no, not necessarily. There's all other kinds of what we call mechanisms of adjustment that businesses can do. For instance, I have a paper showing that restaurants, very highly affected industry by minimum wage workforce, increase their prices in response to a higher minimum wage. Of course, it's not anywhere near to the degree that sometimes you hear about in the press. Basically, for a 10% increase in the minimum wage, you see less than a 1% increase in prices, which makes sense because the price of any plate of food isn't completely deterministic by the low-wage workforce in that business, correct? It also has to do with rents and how much food costs and energy and all that type of thing. So
Sure.
you have other mechanisms of adjustment. You have lower turnover of workers. You have cost savings due to reduced spending on recruiting and retention that is rampant in the low-wage workforce. I mean, in restaurants, turnover can be over 100% over a year. So not necessarily. Again, you have increased spending of the folks who are getting the increased wages due to minimum wage policies. It's not necessarily the case that in this simple Econ 101 supply and demand world that you hear a lot about, that you increase the price of something, the demand is going to fall. The low-wage labor market is much more it's much more complex than that.
Well, and you bringing up the complexity of it all, post-recession, we've turned into this gig economy, as a lot of people refer to it, where people may be working 2 or 3 jobs. Is it possible to measure the effect of a minimum wage increase in an economy such as this?
Well, it is, because we know, again, the highest users in industries and certain occupations of minimum wage workforce. Again, a reason why a lot of my work looks at the restaurant industry is because it's kind of the canary in the coal mine. They're very intense, heavy users of the low-wage workforce, the minimum wage workforce. So you can start there, especially limited service, fast food establishments. If you want to really see if there's been an effect of a minimum wage policy, you can start to look there. That makes a lot of sense, because that's where you would expect to see an effect on wages and employment, for instance. So when you throw in things like the gig economy and people having 2 or 3 jobs, well, it gets a little bit more complex, because we don't know what those people are actually paid. They're mostly contract workers. Our surveys where we get the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics only has pretty good information on your first job. So it definitely makes it, there are data limitations that we have to think about, but it still is possible to analyze minimum wage policies regardless of this gig economy that's happening underneath.
Now, when it comes to federal minimum wage, what about employees who work for tips, where that's not usually servers at restaurants and things, where they're typically not getting even the federal minimum wage, they're getting something else? Is their situation likely to change? Will they get a little extra piece of the pie?
This is a very good question, because it's one that's overlooked and one that's near and dear to my heart as an ex-food server and bartender. But in the U.S., again, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. That's the regular minimum wage. And then there's a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. It's $2.13 an hour. It has been so since 1991. Due to very powerful lobbyists, the other NRA, the National Restaurant Association in Washington, D.C., have been very successful in keeping that $2.13 an hour, which most people find just unbelievable, and people often tell me I must be mistaking, but that is the fact, $2.13 an hour since 1991. But you do have states such as California, only 7 states, California and Washington and Oregon, that don't allow for a sub-minimum wage for their tipped workforce. So you have, for instance, in California and Washington, for example, we not only don't have a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, we also have much higher regular minimum wages, above $7.25, in those states. And it could be shocking, because the Restaurant Association keeps saying we can't get rid of the $2.13 an hour. It would completely destroy the restaurant industry. But I'm here to tell you, as a resident of California, the restaurant industry is booming here. Absolutely. So we have kind of a natural experiment that's happening across the country, not just with minimum wages, but with sub-minimum wages that go from $2.13 an hour all the way up to $12, $13 an hour that are in states that don't even allow for a sub-minimum wage.
I am shocked that the sub-minimum wage has not increased since I last served a beer across a bar.
I hear that from a lot of people. I hear that from.
Oh, my goodness, that's just terrible. All right, well, Sylvia Allegretto, labor economist, co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Sylvia, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon. It's
been fun. You're very welcome.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Political analyst Dante Chinni says that there is less of a blue state, red state divide than political warfare between regions within certain states. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Wall Street analysts tell us that Amazon's $14 billion buyout of Whole Foods Market is not only a win-win for them, but also for consumers. Why? Because Amazon intends to lower the organic grocers' prices. Really? Yes, say the analysts, because Amazon will use its amazing computer-driven tactics to cut Whole Foods' cost of selling groceries. But Amazon's robotic efficiency is achieved by cutting people. It squeezes suppliers, for example, demanding that they give bankrupt-level wholesale prices to the retail colossus. That means small organic farmers and food artisans are destined to be squeezed out of Whole Foods, displaced by deep-pocket global food makers who are willing to cut corners on quality and the environment in order to get on Amazon's new grocery shelves. Next will come Whole Foods' helpful and friendly workforce. Jeff Bezos, Amazon CEO, doesn't view workers as assets but as costs. So to jack up the grocery chain's profit, he'll cut those costs, a.k.a. people. He's already testing a store concept that has no cashiers to interfere with your shopping experience, using computer sensors to take your money electronically instead of paying bothersome humans to do the job of checking you out and, God forbid, conversing with you. Oh, another plus of connecting us to the corporate computers is that they will track and record our every move and every purchase, building a detailed personal profile on each of us in order to do what? And why? This is Jim Hightower saying, according to the calendar, we're living in 2017, but the brave new future of Amazon's electronic, robotic Whole Foods market tells us we're living in the corporatized version of 1984. It's a world in which the human need for jobs and personal relationships are subverted to the corporate love of automation and avaricious profits.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. State politics expert Dante Chinni predicts that the Electoral College will remain in place until someone wins the popular vote by so much that denying the winner the White House will lead to changing the Constitution. 3 million votes isn't enough, he says. It needs to be 5 or 6 million. And we say hello to Dante Chinni, who runs the American Communities Project at George Washington University and writes the Politics Counts blog for the Wall Street Journal. Also, an author of the book, Our Patchwork Nation. Dante Chinni, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's nice to have you back again. You know, Donald Trump won the election by flipping a relative small number of voters in 4 states. Was that an anomaly, or did it foretell a sea change in how we understand the red state, blue state divide?
Well, to some extent, we'll know the answer to that question by 2020, right? But I do think that when you look at what happened, there were the voters that he flipped. You're talking about really 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that he flipped by winning those states by a total, all the 3 states, at 78,000 votes. It's not a lot of votes. What really happened is you look at those states, and there was just he did remarkably well with kind of these blue collar suburban places, and really those were the way I look at it through the American Communities Project, that's a particular type of place, and he really he ran up his margins in those places, and that's how he won. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, and it's the same set of places. What are they like? They're all kind of slightly lower than average or about average household income, lower college education figures than nationally, whiter, but they're not really rural. And I think that something people think about a lot with the campaign is that Trump won by winning all these kind of places that are really hurting and barely getting by. These places aren't like that, but they're places that things used to be better there. And he came in promising he was going to bring back something, and they voted for him. Now, will they stick with him? The promises he made are not easy to meet, and it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, the one that jumps out at me is, the coal jobs. I mean, we've been moving away from coal for a long, long time, so that's tough to see. But, as I mentioned, you're the author.
Yeah, there's so few jobs. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say in coal, there's only there's 280,000 jobs nationally. It's just not that many jobs, but it's the promises out there. The other one, I think, is the promise to bring manufacturing jobs back. Manufacturing jobs as a percentage of employment in the United States have been declining fairly steadily over the past 30 or 40 years. Turning that tide is not an easy thing.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say that, I mentioned at the top that you're the author of Our Patchwork Nation. Do you think states matter in national elections anymore, or will future candidates like a Trump win by appealing to a patchwork of many demographic groups?
Well, it's really both, right? I mean, states, obviously, as long as we have an election system such that we do with an electoral college, then the states are going to matter. But to me, it's never really about the individual states. It's when you take the states apart and look at the things that go into making that state what it is, that's what tells you something. So, again, he won these 3 states. He won Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But he really won them by winning a specific kind of place. So it's really, the 2 things really go hand in hand. And I think particularly with a candidate like Trump, he's appealing to a niche, a specific kind of community, and that community is prevalent in some states, and those states were enough to swing the thing for him.
Then do you think this last election perhaps suggests that it's time to change the method of electing presidents?
Well, that would be extremely difficult. I do think, look, there are a few warning signs in this election, and that Hillary Clinton did win by about 3 million votes in the popular vote, yet she lost the Electoral College fairly convincingly. If that happened again, if we got up to somebody winning the popular vote by 5 million votes, 6 million votes, and still losing the Electoral College, I think you might see some anger and some call for changing things. Now, whether or not you could actually change it, that's a whole different question. That's a constitutional change, and it's not easy. That would be a very difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you say, I mean, the numbers. She was 3 million, and it was a lot closer the last time we saw it. But if perhaps that dictates it after all.
Yeah.
We're speaking with Dante Chinni, who runs the American Communities Project at George Washington University, writes the Politics Counts blog, and as I mentioned, author of the book Our Patchwork Nation. Dante, does the installation of a general as White House Chief of Staff, does that signal stability in the executive branch, or is it a move toward authoritarian control of government?
Well, I'm less worried about the latter, about authoritarian control of government under the Trump people, at least right now, than I am about somebody getting control over that. I mean, look, I think it's, whatever your politics, if you look at what's happened in the White House over the past 6 months, you see a White House that is very difficult to control and rarely seems to be on the same page. And I think that what he did was he brought in somebody with a military background. Trump really does, seems like, respect the military, and he's hoping that can fix the problems they've had. Now, will it? I don't know. You wonder how much of this is just about the particular individual who's president and just kind of the way he does things. But I think that the real hope among the folks in the White House is that this is a sign of somebody coming in, a military person who can put some kind of order on a White House that really needs it right now.
And who has a great track record and that sort of thing. He's been a great serviceman and all this sort of, but he has to control one thing in particular in that White House that is unimaginable to me, and that's the guy at the top.
Yeah, and the thing that's really interesting is back in June, I went down to the Hampton Roads area here around D.C., and it's a military community. I went down there for a reason. I wanted to talk to people. I'd seen some stuff on the polling data that suggested Trump was having some troubles in these military communities, and I wanted to go down there and talk to people. And the really interesting thing when I was down there was even the people who supported Trump down there and people who liked him even in terms of policy or thought he maybe was shaking things up in the right way were not happy about the way he was conducting himself on Twitter, and they were not happy with the way he was kind of bad-mouthing other people in the military kind of industrial establishment. And, look, those people really ride a lot on decorum. So the idea that Kelly is in there, I think that the hope is that he can bring some of that kind of attitude to that part of the White House, or to the White House really. And I don't know. It's going to be an interesting challenge for him. That's for sure.
I'm sure for many, when John Kelly was picked, it was a sigh of relief for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, especially in a place like that. Absolutely, yeah. Especially in places like that.
But as you sort of touched on there in your answer, Trump has managed to offend pretty much every ally, every U.S. intelligence agency, the Pentagon, LGBT community, Hispanics, that's just to name a few. Will he remain president for the remainder of his term?
Those are, I don't like to get into those games of prognostication. And at this point, it's guesswork, really. I mean, he's offended a lot of people. And I don't know if he can keep going on at this pace. At some point, it seems to me like he's got to find a way to kind of step back a little bit. The thing that I think is the most kind of interesting about Trump in his first 6 months in office is all he's doing is talking to his base. And he's kind of, he's speaking, and his base, by his base, I mean really this kind of populist blue-collar group of former manufacturing workers around the industrial Midwest and in rural America. That's who he's speaking to, it seems, all the time. And as he's talking about all these other groups, and you talk about the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, even LGBT community, who he'd kind of reached out to during the campaign. He just isn't doing anything to try to win those folks over to his side, at least not in any of his actions or his words. So he's put himself. I mean, basically, he's not doing a lot to grow any kind of support that he has. He's hitting at his own support, and kind of, it seems like, making his position weaker and weaker. Now, what does that mean? Does he end up leaving the White House early? That's like, there's a lot that has to happen for that to occur. But he's not helping himself, that's for sure. I mean, he's really not doing much to grow his area of support to find voters that are going to kind of maybe on the fence with him, who are ready to come on board. If anything, if you look at the poll data, he's pushed people away. He hasn't, I haven't looked yet today, but he had not broken 40% in Gallup's daily tracking poll since June 22nd. That's pretty remarkable.
Wow.
That's you're talking about over a month since he's broken 40%. That's a pretty remarkable statistic.
I mean, I think I could even get 40% of the country to like me. But
I don't know if I could. I don't know if I could, but 40%, not breaking 40 is pretty tough. That's a tough number.
Well, with everything that we keep hearing, and obviously nothing's come to complete fruition yet, and I'm kind of thinking of Russian investigation. Has he done anything at this point, in your eyes, possibly egregious enough for impeachment? Because there's been that talk.
I'm not going to get into the impeachment discussion. I refuse to do it. And and really, impeachment is whether or not somebody gets impeached is really that is purely in the eyes of the people who are sitting in Congress right now and the way they view it. And again, it's time will tell whether or not that's there. It's going to be tough. He's got Republican majorities in both houses, and it makes it a heck of a lot tougher to find reasons to want to to impeach this man. But I think it's for right now. I just don't want to get into that discussion.
Fair enough. What about this one? Is he a threat to America's standing in the world, or is he perhaps the result of just a passing temper tantrum by voters?
Well, I mean, so the question, I think it is an interesting question, like how the world responds to him, and I guess that's something we're going to have to see again over time. But the one thing you wonder is, with all the stuff he's doing on Twitter, all the kind of pronouncements he makes on Twitter, and look, he is certainly not a conventional president in any way, shape, or form. Is he so different that the rest of the world looks at him and tends to, like when he fires off something on Twitter, tends to not take it seriously and, just be like, oh, that's just, this is the kind of guy Donald Trump is. He's kind of a hothead. He's got a lot of, he needs to kind of lash out every once in a while. And they don't take it seriously. And that may be the case. It may be that all this stuff that's going on Twitter, there's so much of it. It's so voluminous. It just seems like it never stops. That maybe in the end, the rest of the world looks at it and because of that tends to discount some of that stuff. And probably I think for people when you talk about like General Kelly and Mattis, I mean that's probably they would probably ladder rather that it was seen that way. I mean I don't know them personally, obviously, but I mean I think the idea that like, he's out there saying these things on Twitter, and the hope is that he says so much on Twitter that people tend to just kind of give him a pass. I think that would be the hope anyway.
Okay. Well, and time will tell, of course. Dante Chinni, who runs the American Communities Project at George Washington University, author of the book Our Patchwork Nation, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Dante, as always, great to talk with you. Thanks for being with us, and we look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks a lot.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now author John Nichols talks about his new book, Trumpocalypse, with Bill Press.
Joining us in studio as a friend of Bill for this next hour, one of the strongest progressive voices in the country. You see him often on cable television, and you read him in The Nation magazine and other publications. And I don't know, I'm a little jealous because he's able to pound out more books than I am. We're both sort of in a race here, but he's winning the race. His latest is Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse.
You did it!
I got it. Yay. It is a challenge, and it is a great look at all the people around Donald Trump. John, it's so good to see you.
It's an honor to be with you.
From the great state of Wisconsin.
It has been great, historically.
There's still a residual greatness there.
I love Wisconsin with all my heart and all my soul. But I do write in this book about people like Paul Ryan, and so I have to acknowledge we don't always get things right.
Yeah, but you got to balance him with Mark Pocan.
You betcha.
Is Scott Walker in the book?
Scott Walker is mentioned, of course, but of course he was horrifically defeated for president.
Loser.
Horrifically defeated and overlooked for any job in the
Well, I would be careful. One of the things that I emphasize in this book is that Donald Trump has he's got a lot of moving pieces in his game. And so people will come and leave his administration. You'll see people arrive. But the core thing that I emphasize in this book is Donald Trump's given power to a lot of people who should not have power.
Right. And that's what we're going to be getting into with John Nichols here and with you. Your comments always welcome again at BP Show. But first,
This
Give it
is
to
the
Jamie
full
for the
court
headlines
press.
here.
Just a couple of other stories for you on this Thursday morning. We begin with Spicy, Sean Spicer.
Oh, spicy.
Today's his last day. Today is Sean
Whoa.
Spicer's last official day in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, what's he been doing? Hanging around getting a paycheck ever since he was fired.
Well, and is Priebus really gone? Right?
I don't
think
know.
so.
That's the weird part. They don't actually leave.
No, right.
I hadn't thought about that either. It has been reported by CNN that Sean Spicer's White House colleagues will be throwing him a farewell party Thursday night.
At the White House?
At the White House. Hopefully, Sean will be able to make use of that mini fridge that he stole a couple months back. Put some bottles of champagne in there.
He can
keep
tell
him cool.
stories. He can tell stories about the visit with the Pope.
That's right. So, Sean did finally get to meet the Pope a couple of days ago, but other than that, he hasn't been doing much. We'll wait and see what Sean Spicer's next move after the White House may be. To Sicily we go, where researchers have found traces of a 6,000-year-old wine on ancient pottery. They found it in a cave in Sicily, and that means that folks may have been starting to drink wine earlier than we originally thought. Between 1300 and 1100 BC was the original time frame that we thought wine production began in that region in the Middle Bronze Age. But now, with the traces of tartaric acid and sodium salt on the wine, could be about 6,000 years ago now. So
People are smarter than we thought.
People were smarter than we thought. A quick update on the fundraising in Houston. Texans player J.J. Watt has been challenging celebrities and regular folks alike to get $10 million contributed to a fund he has going. He's at $8.5 million right now. Good for J.J. Watt. That's huge.
It's a great step up thing to do.
The Dallas Cowboys and the Houston Texans were scheduled to play a preseason game tonight. It was originally supposed to be in Houston. They then moved it to Arlington, Texas, where the Cowboys play. However, the Texans now have a chance to go home early, so that game has been canceled.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. John Nichols here, horseman of the Trumpocalypse.
On your radio, on TV, and online. This is the Bill Press Show.
The United States of America. No, it's the divided states of America under Donald Trump. That's the showing in the latest Fox News poll. Yes, Fox News poll. This is not Huffington Post. This is not Politico. This is not the Bill Press Show. This is Fox News saying 56% of the American people say that Donald Trump is tearing this country apart. Hello, everybody. Great to see you. The Bill Press Show on a Thursday, August 31. As we boom out to you from our nation's capital and our studio on Capitol Hill with all the news of the day and a great person to help us through it, John Nichols, the national affairs correspondent for The Nation, author of many great books, the latest, Horseman of the Trumpocalypse. John Nichols, great to see you.
I'm honored to be with you. And when I wrote this book, I did not recognize that the biggest challenge would be pronouncing Trumpocalypse. But it's been a test for hosts around the country.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Some get it, but I think you have.
But I don't believe you for a second. I think I think you diabolically put this up there.
I like to test people.
Exactly.
But I also want people to. I really want people to take this concept of a Trumpocalypse in.
Yeah.
And to understand that, if we really look at this, Donald Trump's not capable of doing it. Donald Trump may be capable of giving us an apocalypse, and that's something we always have to talk about and be afraid of. But a Trumpocalypse would be the whole of this agenda, the whole of this thing sweeping over our country and remaking our country in ways we would never understand it or recognize it. And that can only happen if we stop paying attention to all the people he has put in positions of power in government.
Right. So I want to, looking through the book, and I kind of broke people down in the categories, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Because some of them are really, really dangerous. Some of them we know about. Some of them we don't know about. Mm-hmm. Some of them have come and maybe gone. We're not sure.
I would be very careful about I write about this in the book. If you know Donald Trump, you never really leave Donald Trump.
Right.
It's sort of like joining an organization. You never leave.
All right. So I was walking down beyond the Capitol out to lunch yesterday, and I walked. I decided it was a beautiful day. I was going to walk. So this gets relevant here. I'm not just chatting.
No, I'm liking walking on a beautiful day.
So walking down East Capitol, and I ran into a friend of mine, and she said, "Where are you going? Are you going around the corner to see Steve Bannon?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, he lives right over there, and he comes in our bookstore all the time. So he does live in the neighborhood." Now, Steve Bannon, is he gone or is he not gone?
He's not gone.
Sebastian Gorka, is he gone or is he not gone?
He was always gone.
Okay.
There's a difference.
Let's talk about Bannon. Is he still part of the?
Yeah, this is the thing to understand about Steve Bannon
or whatever.
Yeah, I write a lot about him.
And he's
in the
a
book.
dangerous guy, isn't he?
He's a smart man.
Yes,
and that's what makes him dangerous. Two things I always say: when Donald Trump walks into a room with the other people in his administration, he is often one of the smartest people in the room, because he has empowered a lot of people who really aren't that capable. You look at his Secretary of Education, for instance.
Yeah.
By the same token,
or Secretary of Housing.
As long as Bannon's in the room, Bannon's the smartest man in the room. He reads. You mentioned the bookstore.
Yeah.
This guy reads obsessively. You give him a topic. You say, "Hey, you're going to be taking this issue on." You'll see him the next day with a pile of books under his arm, and he'll have been up all night, studying. This is a man who has gotten where he's gotten with extreme opinions. I mean, way out on the fringe, but has yet gotten, into positions of power, into positions of influence, because he really works it. He was a success on Wall Street. He was a success in Hollywood. He has been a success in politics.
Could he turn on Donald Trump?
I don't think so, because I think he embraced that term chief strategist. He loves that term. That's what he was in the campaign. That's what he was in the White House. That's what he, I think, in many ways still is. And so I'll say two things about him that I think are hopefully important. Number one, it does see himself as a strategist. After Charlottesville, a smart strategist would do exactly what Steve Bannon did, which is step out, give everybody a chance to say, "Oh, the administration has cleansed itself. It has changed." But then step into a position where you'll be heavily financed by the Mercers, some billionaires who've backed him and backed the president, to pressure the administration to be something, to fit into a certain mold. In that context, you don't necessarily turn on Trump. But what you do turn on is people who you think might pull Trump away from a certain direction. I think Bannon's role from here on out will be to create immense pressure on people in Congress to err toward the more extreme parts of the Trump agenda, to shore up Trump in a number of ways. He may criticize the president. He may actually go at odds with him. But I really emphasize that those who think that, and that's how I've written the book, you don't have to be in the administration to be a part of this. The Mercers aren't in the administration, but boy, they're a part of this. Paul Ryan's not in the administration, yet he has empowered this man at every turn. And so when we start to understand how this works, then you get a better sense of where power really lies. And I will tell you, I came away from writing this book I don't think I understand him perfectly, but understanding a lot more about Steve Bannon. And I can tell you that Steve Bannon will continue to be a presence, and he will shape the next Trump. And that's a big deal.
That is a big deal,
yeah.
Right? When I look at the president's cabinet, there's a mix of people there. I mean, I think there are a couple of clowns. Rick Perry, I would put in that category.
Yeah, just to emphasize, we live in a time where our Secretary of Energy, the guy who handles nuclear waste, is a guy who wanted to eliminate the department he heads, but couldn't remember that.
Right. That sums up Rick Perry. Okay.
Yeah.
Ben Carson.
Ben Carson
housing.
Didn't want the job. I write about this in the book. His people sent signals he didn't want it. And I think there's a reason why they wanted him. And that is that public housing is one of the great treasures of America. It isn't always perfect, sometimes poorly run. It's run by housing administrations around the country. Those administrations rely on federal funding and federal rules and federal structures. If you've got somebody in charge of HUD who is willing to barter off public housing, who's willing to slow the federal money down, create crises at the housing authorities, and then create pressure for them to sell property off to developers, you have delivered for a lot of Donald Trump's friends in profound ways.
Right, exactly. So he's out to undermine the very purpose of the agency that he's heading, as is Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education.
She's the hero of the book.
Whose mission seems to be...
The what now, John?
Right.
Go ahead. Her mission
seems to be to destroy public education and public universities, right?
Yeah, she's right now going, they're renewing for-profit universities, like Trump University. It's amazing. They have no shame. But Betsy DeVos is...
because Trump University was such a huge success.
What a success, yeah. The courts have reminded us. But, Betsy DeVos is a central figure in the book. The book begins with Betsy DeVos's confirmation hearing. And which I think is one of the most amazing things ever to happen in the history of American politics.
One of the most contested from Democrats.
Right, and Republicans, by the way.
Sure.
A couple of Republicans.
Yes.
They had to bring Pence in to get her in the job.
Yeah, right.
But literally, she disqualified herself. Now, the weird thing was Perry, who is, can't remember what job he wants, but at least Perry was charming enough to get through his hearing functionally, and he joked about himself.
Yeah.
Betsy DeVos was so aware of her lack of preparation for this. It was painful. Maggie Hassan from up in New Hampshire asked profound questions, and it was clear that DeVos didn't know the moving parts, what was in and what was out of the agencies she wanted to run, what was federal, what was state. But then the most profound question came from Bernie Sanders, a question that sums up a huge amount of this circle of people that Trump has brought in. He looked her in the eye and he said, Mrs. DeVos, do you think you'd be here if your family hadn't given more than $200 million to Republican candidates? Yeah. And instead of her saying, of course I would be, sir. I'm an expert in education. I've served on my school board. I've served on which she's never done, by the way. She's never been on a school board or anything like that. She said, well, I think probably. Even she could not muster a defense for herself as a nominee. So it's a big deal that she's there, and a dangerous thing.
Okay. But it is dangerous. But then there are those that I think are this is my take, right? And you talk about them here too, that I think are the most dangerous members of the cabinet, and they are Scott Pruitt at EPA and Jeff Sessions at
totally
Justice.
Right.
Am I right?
I would also
in terms
include
of
DeVos, I would include Mulvaney.
Mulvaney.
Yeah, who's very nefarious figure on.
But those two, Pruitt and Sessions, they have taken the president's agenda and their own agenda, and they are running with it.
Yeah, let me suggest something.
They may not be getting anything done in Congress, but those guys are doing a lot of damage.
Yeah, and so one thing that I try to suggest in this book is that we've allowed not just the presidency to become imperial, but the administration to become imperial. George Washington had a cabinet of 4 people. And his vice president, so maybe 5. And what's significant about it is we still remember him. We do plays about him on Broadway, Hamilton, right? And we talk about Jefferson and these folks. Now Trump actually struggles to remember who's in what position. There are points where I write about in the book where he's like introducing people and he's forgetting which department and stuff like that. It's so big, but
as Ronald Reagan did, as we remember.
Well, yes, but these departments are incredibly powerful, and they have huge amounts of administrative power. It is the equivalent of executive orders at the departmental level. So what is Jeff Sessions doing? First off, Jeff Sessions has a position of power of his own. That's why he hasn't been pushed out despite his rumbling with Trump. He is systematically making the Department of Justice the Department of Injustice. We are reversing as a country where we've stood on voting rights and on civil rights issues and a host of issues.
Sentencing.
Yes.
Criminal justice reform.
Drug
reform.
Window. Drug law reform. Things where we really had made progress. This guy he is more extreme than the president. He's been empowered by the president, but now he is pushing it even further. So a terrible, terrible player there, and a dangerous player because of his incredible bigotries as regards immigrants, as regards dissenters, as regards so many people in this country. He's a very bad player.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Sylvia Allegretto, Dante Chinni, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.